Ghostly Business, Halifax, Nova Scotia. In 1820, Alexander Keith, a young immigrant from Scotland, bought a brewery in Halifax and began a tradition of brewing fine beers in Nova Scotia. He had learned the business from an uncle in England a few years earlier, and used what he had learned to become a very successful businessman. He also became a prominent politician, actively involved in the development of Halifax and in the move to have Nova Scotia join Canada's Confederation in 1867. But he never stopped taking pride in his reputation as an excellent brewer. Even now, he seems to linger, checking on the high standards he set nearly 2 centuries ago. Several workers at the brewery market on Halifax's Lower Water Street, home to Alexander Keith's Nova Scotia brewery, are convinced it's his ghost that haunts the place. They've been startled when it makes its presence known in different parts of the establishment, but they're not too frightened by the sound of footsteps wandering through the empty halls. They figure it's just Keith, keeping an eye on what they're doing in his name. However, there are a few disturbing reports of another phantom lurking around the brewery market. This one is not friendly. It's the gory reflection of a blood-covered man that suddenly appears in the washroom mirror. When a terrified customer turns around to see what horror is behind him, he finds there's nothing there, and a hasty dash for the exit seems to be the best thing to do. Deadmans Island, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Elegant yachts now moor along the mainland side of Melville Island, a small island near the head of the northwest arm of Halifax Harbour in Nova Scotia. But in the early 1800s, this was a much grimmer place. Back then, British Navy warships dropped anchor there to unload French and American prisoners of war captured during the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. I botched that word. Napoleonic? I don't know. Anyways, it was... Back then, British Navy warships dropped anchor there to unload French and American prisoners of the war captured during the wars and the War of 1812. The British had built a large military prison there in 1803, specifically to house such prisoners until they could be exchanged for their own captured soldiers and sailors. The captives were warned off trying to escape by being told untruthfully that the waters around the island were filled with hungry sharks. But infectious diseases did claim the lives of some of the men confined there in such close quarters. Their bodies were wrapped in shrouds and rowed to a nearby spit of land that prisoners called Target Hill, and that came to be known as Deadman's Island. Here the remains of close to 200 American sailors and soldiers were buried in shallow graves. So were the bodies of 100 black slaves who had abandoned the American army for the British and then succumbed to smallpox. Then came the Irish immigrants who had died of typhus fever. Most of the prison buildings in Melville Island burned down in 1936, but over the years, people would wander around Deadman's Island looking for relics of its past, and when they did, they occasionally discovered a skeletal remain, giving rise to stories of ghosts haunting the old graveyard. Boys would challenge each other to sneak out to the end of the spit at night, and a few brave souls did spend some spine-tingling moments there, coming back with spooky tales of shapes moving around in the dark. Some of those stories didn't seem so far-fetched, though. When workers became involved in preparations for building a development on Deadman's Island a few years ago, they felt uneasy when unusual lights began to appear among the trees they were planning to cut down. Glowing fires and mysterious lights have also been spotted by people looking across the harbor toward the island, and Alan Hatfield, a psychic, visiting the site in 2002, heard the voices of 3 distinct male spirits. In the late 1990s, some Halifax residents started lobbying to have the spit of land preserved as a historic site, and they were eventually successful. Development plans were halted in 2000 when the city bought the property so it could be respectfully preserved as a burial ground. In May of 2005, representatives of both the American and Canadian Armed Forces took part in a ceremony marking the installation of a bronze plaque on a granite base to honor the memory of the Americans buried there. At last, it seems, many restless souls have found peace, but strange lights are still occasionally spotted on Deadman's Island, and teenagers are still daring each other to head out that way after dark. Headless Mary, Montreal, Quebec. Most people don't go looking for ghosts, and most don't want ghosts to come looking for them. But for more than 130 years, curiosity seekers have gathered in Griffintown, an area of downtown Montreal near the Lachine Canal, hoping to see the ghost of a woman looking for her head. And over the years, parents living in the area have warned their misbehaving youngsters that the headless ghost would come after them while she wandered around searching for it. Griffintown was a bustling working-class neighborhood in Montreal where thousands of Irish immigrants settled when they arrived in Canada in the 19th century. Life was hard for many of the people living there. It was certainly hard for two friends, Mary Gallagher and Susan Kennedy, who were staying in a flat in a house at the corner of William and Murray Streets in the summer of 1879. On the night of June 27th, they'd been socializing with a man named Michael Flanagan when they got into a terrible fight. Mary Gallagher was killed, according to court documents. Susan Kennedy had knocked her to the floor and whacked her several times with an axe, chopping off her head. Jesus. A neighbor living downstairs said the blows overheard were so violent that the ceiling plaster cracked, sending pieces showering down. Susan Kennedy was found guilty of murdering her best friend. Her sentence, death by hanging, was supposed to be carried out on December 5th, 1879, but a judge finally spared her life and sent her to prison instead. She was eventually paroled after serving 16 years in the Kingston Penitentiary in Ontario. In the following years, Mary Gallagher's death, several people reported seeing her on the streets of Griffintown, dressed as she had always been in life. And even though her ghost didn't always appear headless, people said she was looking for her head. As the number of Mary Gallagher sightings dwindled over time, locals began to talk about how she just appeared once every 7 years on the anniversary of her death. A few traces of Gallagher's old neighborhood remained in Montreal. Abandoned factories and slum housing have been replaced by film studios and trendy condos looking over the Lachine Canal. But some folks still gather every 7 years at the corner of William and Murray Streets to mark the passing of the lively, close-knit Irish-Canadian community that once was Griffintown. They do so on June 27th, just in case the headless ghost of Mary Gallagher decides to go for a walk that night. A fine home for a ghost, Regina, Saskatchewan. It's only in Griffintown that people gather in the hopes of running into a ghost. Every October, groups of school children have looked forward to class tours of Saskatchewan's Government House because it's said to be haunted. Government House is a splendid mansion located in Regina's Exhibition Park. Built in the early 1890s, it was at first home to the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Territories, and then to the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, after that province joined Confederation in 1905. In 1945, when World War II ended, the federal government moved the Lieutenant Governor to the Hotel Saskatchewan and used the government residence to care for wounded veterans who had returned from combat. 12 years later, it became an adult education center. In the 1970s, several groups interested in preserving Regina's histrionic sites organized an effort to restore the building to its original elegance, and in the 1980s, it became Government House again. Lieutenant governors didn't live in it anymore, but their offices have been there ever since, and is where the Queen's representative hosts many special occasions. It's also home to a museum highlighting Saskatchewan's history. The last lieutenant governor to live in the mansion was Archibald McNabb. He served the province in that position from 1936 to 1945. During that time, a cook named Chung became ill and died in his room in the servants' quarters. After his death, people could still hear him shuffling around in his slippers through the house's many rooms. Some people still hear those footsteps. The building staff think it is Chung's ghost that shifts things from one place to another, mysteriously opens and closes doors, flips up the corners of tablecloths, flushes toilets and empty bathrooms, and appears briefly in the kitchen every now and then. And even though it frightens some workers to feel an invisible presence hovering in their back stairwell, or to hear footsteps in the hall when they're alone, they've accepted the fact that a ghost has found a home in the mansion. They've even given him a name, Howie. So Howie, whoever or whatever he is, gets blamed for all the strange goings-on in the Government House. He's also the reason why youngsters are so willing to soak up a little history touring the stately home and museum. They're especially attracted by the program that runs in October. It's called Halloween with Howie. It's fun, it's educational, and it sends shivers up their spines. The Voice of Evil. Clarendon, Quebec. Susan Dagg liked her new log house. It was small, just one story with an attic, but she, her husband, George, and their two young children, Susan and Johnny, were settling in nicely. They had built a home in 1889 on a farm at Clarendon, Quebec, a community on the Ottawa River about 10 kilometers south of Shawville. Imagine her disgust, then, when she returned from the cow barn after the morning milking to find her kitchen reeking of human feces. The filthy waste, most likely from the outhouse, had been smeared on the floor from one end of the house to the other. September 15th, 1889 was turning out to be a very unpleasant day. 2 other children were living in the Dagg household at the time. One was Dina Burton McLean, a poor 11-year-old girl who had been sent from Scotland to an orphanage in Belleville until a Canadian family came forward to give her a good home. The Daggs had adopted her with that in mind, and also in the hope that Dina would help Mrs. Dagg care for the 2 younger children. The other was a second orphan, a boy named Dean, who worked for various farmers in the area when they needed extra help. Early on the morning of the 15th, Dean had found a $5 bill on the kitchen floor when he climbed down the ladder from his sleeping quarter in the attic. In 1889, $5 was a lot of money, and he had given the bill to Mr. Dagg, telling him where he had found it. But George was suspicious. The night before, his wife had tucked that bill safely away in her dresser, along with a $2 bill. After Dean headed outside to do some chores, George asked Susan to check the drawer to see if the $2 bill was still there. It wasn't. So George climbed up to the attic to look for it and found it in Dean's bed. Assuming that Dean was a thief and that he had made the mess in the kitchen to distract them from the theft, the Daggs ordered him to leave and reported him to the local authorities. The next day, though, they weren't so sure that they had done the right thing. Dean was gone, but the disgusting waste was back, in the cupboards, on the beds, and mixed in with the food supplies, and they had no clue who the nasty, filth-spreading culprit was. They had no idea either about who spilled milk, broke dishes, moved chairs, knocked over a table, and even splashed water in Mrs. Dagg's face. Not only were the Daggs mystified about what was going on at the house, they were frightened. So when George had to be away from home a few days later, he asked his father to come and stay at his house. That's how John Dagg ended up witnessing some of the spooky incidents plaguing his son's family. He was there when the windows started breaking. He went outside to try to catch the vandal, but there was no one in sight. To add to their misery, over the next several days, the family had to put out dozens of small fires that broke out spontaneously. And one afternoon, an invisible hand hacked off Dina's long braid and cut out large chunks of young Johnny's hair. Then, just when the Daggs thought the situation couldn't get any worse, it did. The unseen force that had been tormenting them so terribly started targeting Dina specifically. She began seeing a dark shape in the house when no one else could, and hearing a deeply gravel voice uttering shockingly crude and vulgar things. She was terrified, and so were the Daggs. Desperate for some peace, they sent Dina to stay with John Dagg for a few days, and the haunting ceased, but as soon as Dina returned, it resumed. By then, word about what was happening at the Clarendon farm had spread throughout the district, and curious neighbors were showing up, hoping to see for themselves some of the eerie incidents. Despite for an explanation, the Daggs consulted a fortune-teller, brought in clergymen, and agreed to have a man named Percy Woodcock from Brockville, Ontario, spend some time with them investigating their plight. Woodcock was a well-respected Canadian artist who was also very interested in the paranormal or supernatural occurrences. Articles about the Clarendon spookiness in local Ottawa Valley newspapers had sparked a desire to learn more about it. He arrived at the Dagg farm on November 16th and spent 2 days interviewing all the family members and anyone else who had direct knowledge of the bizarre goings-on. He went outside with Dina to a small shed where she had last seen the evil spirit that spoke to and through her. There he suffered through a stream of foul language and insults directed at him personally, including threats to break his neck if he didn't leave. More encounters with the snarling, invisible speaker continued the next afternoon, when a crowd of neighbors gathered to watch Woodcock challenge the phantom to identify itself. In turn, it claimed to be both a devil and an angel, leaving observers frightened and confused. After Woodcock left, a minister arrived and the crowd started singing hymns. The ghoulish spirit joined in briefly, laughing at efforts to drive it away, and then it left, threatening to return the next day. Woodcock kept detailed notes of everything that had happened at the Dagg farm in the fall of 1889. He also obtained signed statements from several other witnesses and published his findings in a long report in a Brockville newspaper. He made no mention of the torment continuing after November 19th, and there is no known record that it did. Why it ended suddenly after an agonizing 2 months or why it began in the first place has never been explained. Some locals at the time thought the whole affair was a hoax, but why would the Daggs and Dina try to fool people in such a way? What could they hope to gain, other than a lot of negative publicity? Besides, Woodcock made it very clear that he believed the Daggs and Dina were sincere and truthful, as well as confused and terrified. There were some suggestions that a poltergeist may have been responsible for the bizarre events at Clarendon. A poltergeist is said to be a mischievous, sometimes mean spirit that does things like make strange noises, shake and rattle furniture and windows, snatch and grab small items, and send things flying around a room. It's usually active at night and most often makes its presence known in a household that includes a teenage girl who's under some emotional strain. After a few days or weeks, it seems to stop what it's doing as suddenly as it started. A poltergeist haunting might very well explain what happened to the Daggs and Dina. Maybe Dina deeply missed her home in Scotland, leaving her vulnerable to an encounter with a nasty spirit such as this one. But there's no record of a poltergeist ever speaking through a person the way the Clarendon ghost did, and the identity of the evil presence that possessed Dina and haunted her new home in Canada remains a mystery to this day.